Hi, my name's Ivan Weiss. I'm a portrait and headshot photographer based in King's Cross in London, UK. Welcome to another Affinity Creative session. If you haven't already, please check out the earlier session that I made on color grading for dramatic portraiture. There should be a link to that somewhere down below or on the right of the screen. And of course, subscribe to the Affinity channel for a ton of great content from other photographers, retouchers, graphic artists, and designers. If you'd like to see some more of my work, you can find me on Instagram, ivanweiss.london, or on my website, ivanweiss.london. Today we're going to look at black and white portraiture. If you're watching this live, I'm available in the chat to answer any questions, so please ask me anything. If you're watching the replay, then please let me know what you think in the comments below. So, let's jump in and have a look at black and white portraits. Pretty much every photographer I know likes working in black and white, at least occasionally. It offers us a chance to really focus the attention of the viewer on one particular aspect of the image. As you can see from this image that I've got here, I'm a big fan of the very contrasty look. I like my black and white to be black and white rather than grey and grey. And before we start, I'm just going to show you a bit of the metadata and talk about how this was shot. So the person in the image is Ellen Petter's daughter, who's an actor. She came in maybe a year ago and we created some images for her portfolio. Usually I advise people, if they're shooting black and white, to decide that ahead of time and have that in mind while they're creating the images, because I think it helps to focus the intent of what you're doing for the final product. That said, in this particular case, we were actually shooting for color images, and the black and white just kind of happened after the fact. You can see from these shots, these other final shots that I'm showing now, I had Ellen sitting in the corner of the studio, and I was using the fact that there's a side wall and a back wall to create a bit of depth, using the difference in tonality of the two walls to have a bit of compositional interest. But then this shot, when I was reviewing the whole shoot later on, this shot jumped out and I felt that it would benefit from being simplified. If we zoom in here, we can have a look at the lighting. So I'm going to show you the catch lights in the eyes. You can see that I have a beauty dish. It's a 70 centimeter white beauty dish from Elinchrom as our key light that's giving us the main shape to the image. And on the right, we've got a 1 foot by 3 foot flex panel from Westcott providing fill. If I zoom out just a little bit, we can see that there's also a little bit of light kicking back off the wall just here, providing a touch more fill and stopping those shadows from going too dense. Before we jump over to see the original image, let's also just look at the metadata. So this was shot on the Canon EOS R with the 50mm 1.2 lens. It's the old version, the EF version, shot at 1/160th of a second, f3.2, ISO 200. So let's go over to see our original image. As you can see, it's quite flat. I tend to shoot with a flat profile and do my raw conversion in such a way that I've got a bit of room to maneuver in my post-production. So the blacks are not all the way black, the whites are not all the way white. It's quite flattened out contrast-wise. The colors are not too saturated either. So again, I've got some scope for maneuvering things if I want to during post-production. This was converted from the raw file using, I believe, the Technicolor flat profile that's designed for use for video, but video producers very often do a lot of color grading, and so I find that's very useful for the style of photography that I do as well. Now, when we look at this image as it is, It all looks pretty good. I mean, it's fairly well balanced. I've already cropped it to my preferred 4:5 crop, and I don't see any major problems. However, because I'm going for black and white, I want to decide where I'm going to direct the viewer's attention and what therefore is distracting from that and needs to be removed. Because I'm going to be using a lot of contrast, I'm anticipating needing to do a bit of skin retouching because the contrast will amplify any differences in skin texture and any uneven tonality in the skin. And also this background with the two bits of the wall joining here in the corner is probably going to be distracting. So I'm going to take care of that as well. The first thing I'm going to do is to give myself a new layer, and I'm going to get the in-painting brush tool, and I'm going to start looking for anything that needs to just be removed. So let's have a look. We've got over here tiny little bit of hair that's catching the light there. I'm doing this on the new layer. I'm gonna pan round here. There's a couple of bits of hair that are just catching the light and not really to my liking. I'm fine with hair being a bit messy. That's what hair does. But if it's a little more distracting, then I will take it away. So for example, this hair over here, I find that to be not to my liking, so that gets zapped. Around the top here, maybe these ones can go. There we go. And then around to the side, again, we've got a few bits here that are just unnecessarily sticking out, so they get taken care of. And then let's come further down. These ones here are fine, I think. Nothing to worry about there. And then let's zoom out a little more. Yeah, that all looks fine to me. So I'm just going to save my image because I've made some changes, and that's good. And then over here, I'm going to merge visible, and I'm going to start working to increase contrast. Before I get to crushing all those blacks down, I like to make sure that I've got a way to retain some of the detail in there. And a great way that I do that I really like, is to use the tone mapping persona. This is something that is very easy to overdo. It's a question of taste, of course. If you like it really, really strong, a really strong effect, then by all means go for that. I'm going to overdo it and then scale it back and blend it in a little more gently. So we'll just wait for that to load. And while that's doing that, I'll say that that's actually a technique that I use fairly often, and you'll see throughout this little video that I overdo things and then use the blending options to just pull them back to where they're having the amount of effect that I want, but not being too strong. So you can see that when the tone mapping persona opens up, it's got this very exaggerated look to it. I'm going to go in here and tone compression 12, And on the local contrast, which is the bit I'm most interested in, I'm going to go to 55. And you can see that looks awful. It's made the skin look really crunchy and dirty. But that's actually what I want for now, because this is on its own layer. And because it's on its own layer, it means that I can blend it in as I wish. So the first thing I'm going to do is knock that down to about 70% opacity. And then I'm going to open the blend options. Now, all I'm interested in here is getting that local contrast in the shadows, which in this image is basically the shirt and a little bit of the shadows around the sides, edges of the face. So I'm going to first of all take my highlight slider and bring that all the way down to 0. I don't want anything in the highlights. I'm going to uncheck linear, and then I'm going to get a point somewhere here and drag that across like this, and then a point somewhere here just to make that smooth, that transition. So now if I turn that off and then back on, you'll see it's affecting the shirt and really not much else, which is exactly as I want it to be. Now, let's see if we can deal with this background. One way to do it would be to select the subject and then just drop in a completely white background, which could be good. But I'm quite interested in maintaining this little bit of fall off into shadow that we've got lower down in the image. That feels natural to me with the pattern of the light. So I kind of want to retain that. And because of the position of the subject, this problem of the joining of the walls only really exists at the top of the image. So I'm going to get my flood select tool and see how much of this I can grab. Let's see what that does. It's just going to have a little think, and I'm going to tell it add, and I'm going to try and isolate the subject from the background using this. So we'll just have a couple of goes there. That's good. And then come down here and get the bits at the bottom. We're getting there. This is a pretty good selection tool. I like this. It usually gives me a really good selection at the first pass. So we've got our selection now. I'm going to click refine, and we're just going to make sure that it's treating the edges of the hair appropriately. So I leave all of the default values set, and the adjustment brush is for matte. I'm just going to make that brush a little bigger and go around the edges to make sure it's doing that the way that I want. Then go over the hair, which is probably the most problematic part. Come down here and get into that bit where the hair is a little more transparent, and then just finish that off by coming down here and let Affinity do the hard work of making that selection. There we go. I'm now going to apply, and using that selection I'm going to open a levels adjustment, and I want that to be on its own. So I'm going to release it so it sits up the top, and this levels adjustment is only going to affect the selected portion. So if I were to drag the black level all the way up, for example, you see it's only affecting the selected portion. Oh, that looks kind of interesting. As we've got that, we don't need to have our marching ants, so I'm going to get rid of them. And in order to flatten out that background, the first thing I'm going to do is drag the gamma all the way over to 0. And you can see that gives us this whited out background, which is a bit too white for what I want. So I'm going to drag the white level down to somewhere like, let's have a look, 70, 73 looks kind of good. If I switch that off and then on again, that's looking about right. Now the thing is, I don't really want it to be affecting the lower part of the image, so I'm going to add a mask, and in the mask I'm going to get my gradient tool and I'm going to tell it to apply the mask fully at the top, not at the bottom. I'm going to open this little dialog here and say that the end of that gradient line should be where the effect is 0. So HSL sliders, and drag that all the way across to black. That looks pretty good to me. Now, if I switch that off and then back on again, you can see it's made the top of the image a little lighter, which is good. The bottom of the image stays kind of where it is. I quite like it. I'm maybe gonna adjust that down just a little bit in opacity to something like 70, 70, let's say 80. That's about right. And then I'm going to just go in, don't need to do that, and merge visible so that I've got a new layer to work on, because next thing we're going to do is go in and clean up some of the skin. So I'll save that and we're all good to go. Now, the reason I'm going to go in and do some skin work is because we're going to have a very contrasty image. Let's just jump over and remind ourselves of what the final one looks like. Okay, so if we were not to do any skin work, some of the elements in the skin, the freckles, the shadow under the eye, would probably feel too strong and be a bit distracting. So we're going to tone those down somewhat. If I just zoom in a little here, I'm going to open the frequency separation filter, and this is great. I love this in Affinity. It gives me this preview screen which allows me to see what amount of separation I want, i.e. what radius to set in the frequency separation dialog. So for example, currently it's at 2 pixels, which is the default. If I'm looking to deal with just this bit of shadow here, at 2 pixels, it doesn't exist at all on the high frequency layer, but I've still got the skin texture. I still want to retain the skin texture. If I go to a larger radius, let's say drag this across to something like, I don't know, 8 maybe, 9, something like that, and then look again at what's going on here, we can see there's less of the shadow on the low frequency layer because some of it now exists on the high frequency layer. Now, it's going to depend on the kind of work you're doing and the kind of look that you want. If you're doing beauty work, maybe you'll go for several rounds of frequency separation so that you can use a pixel value that's really specifically targeted at the issue that you want to correct for. Because I'm not going for something so sort of glossy and perfect looking, I tend to find a compromise that works for all or at least most of the issues and do everything in one round of frequency separation. So in this image, I'm thinking if I go for something like, let's see, 5 is probably going to be a nice sort of halfway point. So we've still got a little bit of the shadow remaining on the high frequency layer, but the majority of it is on the low frequency layer where I want it. So I'm going to commit to that, and that gives us a low frequency layer and a high frequency layer. In between the two, I'm going to open a new empty layer and I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to open a layer that's going to help me to see what I'm doing. So in my adjustments panel, I'm going to go to black and white. I'm going to click on that and I'm going to go for this, which I've called Retouch Reveal. And essentially what this is, as you can see from the sliders, is an exaggerated black and white. It makes the reds really very dark. Most of the problems that we're looking to correct for when we're retouching a skin are going to exist in the reds. So this just helps me to see them more clearly. We're not going to actually leave that effect switched on in the final version. We'll come back to our layers. So that can sit at the top there. We'll go to our empty layer. I'm again going to get my in-painting brush, make sure it's set to current and below. And we're going to zoom in and just look for where those problems are the deepest. So for example, around here, these laugh lines, by going over with the in-painting brush, I'm going to soften them somewhat. They're not going to go away completely. I don't want them to go away completely. I don't want to make it look like there's no laugh line there. I just want to make sure that when I add the contrast later on, I don't get too deep a shadow in that line, which will become a bit distracting. So I'm going to do those little details there. Excuse me. And this little detail here. There's a few bits in the pores of the skin that are perhaps a little deep. Here on the chin as well, where there's some more folds in the skin, some wrinkles. Let's just get rid of those, or rather tone them down. We're not getting rid of them. That's all good. Now, of course, Ellen's got freckles in her skin, so I want to make sure I'm not removing any freckles. I don't want to do that. I just want to deal with the slightly deeper pores. Eyelid, and in here. And then on the camera left eye, same thing. So I'm just going to come into these bits that are deepest so that they get softened up just a little bit, not too much. There we go. That's good. Then let's come up to the forehead. I think there's a little bit here that's probably a little deeper than I would like. So that's gone. Let's zoom out a little bit. Perhaps over here we can just soften that one as well. And then let's come back something like this. Yeah, this is good. This is good. I'm going to save. So the next thing I'm going to do is add another empty layer. Oops, I've added two. I just need the one. And I'm going to get my healing brush tool, make sure that's set to current layer and below, flow 10%, opacity 100, hardness 0. And we're going to deal with this shadow under the eye. So I'm going to select from somewhere here, and I'm just going to paint that in like so. Lovely. And then we're going to do the same on the other side. That's good. I'm just going to come in a little more detailed and just clean up a bit there and a bit there. That looks good. Now that effect is probably too strong for me, so I'm just going to back off the opacity somewhat to maybe, I don't know, 50, 55, something like that. Let's switch it off and see, that's just softened that up nicely. I'm now going to get another layer and let's zoom in a little and just use the same technique to deal with a few other areas where there's perhaps more shadow than I would like. Let's see here. Just a tiny bit so that when we add all that contrast in a short while, it's not quite as strong. That's good there. And perhaps a little bit there. And then perhaps even some more down here on the chin. And you can see it's just taking a little bit out. Not too much. I don't want it to feel unnatural and too polished. And I'm going to add a third layer for this this brush and just come up here and do the same thing with these deeper shadows in the neck. I don't want to remove this completely. Neck wrinkles are normal, we all have them. Oops, that doesn't look so good there. Let's soften that out. And soften that out. And then probably just bring the opacity of that layer also down to something like 50%. So it's still there. Let's zoom out and we can see if I select all of those layers and turn them off and then on again, it's just tightening up the image the way I want it to be. So next I'm gonna enhance a bit of the contrast and start drawing the viewer's attention into the eyes and the tops of the cheeks where I want them to be. We're going to use some dodging and burning to do that. And the way I like to do dodge and burn is to use a curves layer. And I'm going to have two of them, so I'll just duplicate that. And in my dodge layer, I'm going to set my curve to the blend mode screen. And then in my burn layer, I'm going to set it to blend mode multiply. Then I'm going to invert, and invert. So effectively what we've done is with the screen layer, it's going to add that effect, but we're inverting it so we can brush it in. And in the burn layer, same thing, it's going to add that effect, but we're going to brush it in just where we want it. So let's go in and we'll call up a brush, and the brush is going to be set to opacity 100, flow 1%, hardness 0, and it's a white brush. I'm going to make that somewhat larger, maybe a little less than that, and I'm going to start just going in to where the highlights already exist in the face. And just enhancing them somewhat. Let's zoom in a touch more. So lower lip highlight, and now on the upper lip a bit of a highlight. Bring that in like this. Bring this in like so. So I'm just enhancing what's already there. And we don't really need to be very precise here at all. Again, the technique is I'm going to draw this in. It's going to look kind of comical, like a caricature, and then I'm going to back it off a lot. But being able to see it so well while we're drawing it in is really useful, I find. So then we come in here. There isn't a highlight here, but I'm just going to use this as another way to soften a little bit that shadow that's there, and then amplify a bit the highlight that's on the cheek. And again, something like this. We can always use it as well to enhance a little bit of the furrowing of a brow, which is nice. I like that. Adds to the expression, enhances the expression a little. So we'll put a bit more highlight up the top there. Just get that in there. That's good. And then some highlight just under the end of the brow as well. While we're here, we'll probably just help this little bit of highlight in the hair somewhat as well. That's good. Now, obviously there's a highlight on the forehead created by the light pattern. It's fine already for me. I don't need to amplify that. I don't want to do anything additional there. So we're going to now go to our burn layer and just burn in a little darker in the parting in the hair. That's good. And then we're going to come down and essentially do the opposite of what we just did with the dodge. So where we've got the highlight above the eyebrow and below the eyebrow, we're then going to put some shadow into the eyebrow itself. So there we go. Same thing on this side, a little more. And then just amplifying that highlight by putting a shadow next to it. So we create a bit more contrast, a bit more pop. Corners of the eyes, it's nice to always get a bit of shadow in there. And then let's zoom out a little bit and see That's starting to look good. Obviously, as I said, it's a very exaggerated effect at the moment, but we'll see how that works. So I just put a little shadow around there. Probably don't need much on this side of the cheek because the shape of the light already is doing that for us, and I don't want to overdo it in an extreme way, but we can just shape the face a little more to make the middle of that face pop. There we go. And then again, just as a way to enhance the highlights that we've put on the lip, I'm going to come in and put some shadow in here in between, and to make that lower lip protrude a touch more, we'll put some shadow underneath it. Okay, let me zoom out. That's looking crazy and comical, right? Maybe just a touch more on this side. Just soften that up. Lovely. Okay. It looks like a very pronounced effect. First thing I'm going to do is soften that up by calling up the blur filter, and I'm going to put that at something like 30 pixels, and I'm going to blur my highlights, apply, and away we go. Then I'm going to go to my curve for burn, and again I'm going to blur that at about 30, so they're softened up. And now I'm going to duplicate that layer, so I've got two lots of burn going on, and I'm going to blur that second layer at a larger radius, so something like, I don't know, 80, somewhere around there, 79.5, 80, apply. That's looking good. And then I'm going to select all three of those, and I'm going to put the opacity at about 15, let's say. If I switch those off and then back on, you can see that's just drawing our attention into her expression just that little bit more. When I do this in color work, usually I'm working with the opacity at around 10%, but I find that with black and white, you've got a bit more license to really amp that up. So 15, maybe even 20. Use your judgment, and you'll see what it looks like once you get towards finalizing your shot. So this black and white layer that we had before, that was there just to help us. We don't need that anymore, so we can delete. And what we're going to do now is go into our adjustments panel, and we're going to get some curves. We don't need that just yet. And we're going to open two curves. We're going to open one, and when we're going to duplicate that, and the second one, we're going to set it to this. Okay, so let me just explain to you what we're doing there. Our first curves adjustment. This is restricting our range. You can see that the highlights are pulled down and the blacks are pulled up. And then there's an S curve, a fairly gentle S curve. So we're just increasing the contrast in the midtones and flattening out the image in terms of its overall range. If I switch it off, it goes from there to there. Then with the second curve, I'm not limiting the range. I'm putting in a bigger S curve, so I'm really amping up the contrast. And when I put that on, it looks like that. This is kind of crazy at the moment, but what I'm going to do in between the two is I'm going to add an adjustment, and it's going to be HSL, hue, saturation, lightness, and it's this one here. And in this layer, what I've got is each of the colors are pulled down to minus 100% saturation, but you'll see that the luminosity shift is different for each one. And that's just to fine tune it the way I like it for my images. And it makes the skin pop the way that I like it to. So we've got that first curve layer, then the black and white adjustment, and then another curves layer to really bring up the contrast. That's looking pretty good, I have to say. Perhaps we could go even more on the contrast. So I'm going to go underneath those ones that I've just added. I've got this brightness and contrast adjustment, and I'm going to pull up the slider even more on the contrast and see what that does for me. Something like that. But it's now looking a little too hot, so I'm just going to knock down the brightness a touch. Something like that. So if I select all of those and switch them off, this was our color image cleaned up, and now we've got this. And that's looking pretty damn good to me. So I'm going to save it. We're nearly done. It's just about the finishing touches now. So let's have a look at what we can do to see if there's anything else that we need. And you can see I'm just flipping the image back and forth to see if there's anything that catches my eye that needs dealing with. I'm liking it as it is. I'm going to flip it upside down. Looks pretty good. Okay, so having a look at the histogram, there's a little bit of space down the bottom and a little bit of space at the top. So I'm going to get a levels layer or adjustment and just drag my white point in to somewhere. I don't want it to be pure white, something like 95, 96 maybe. That's good. And I'm going to bring my black level up. Again, I don't want it to be pure black, but something like 4%. So that's just, again, giving me a bit more contrast, which I like. Then I'm going to bring in some film grain. I like film grain. This layer here is something that I got from, I can't even remember where I got it from now. A resource on the internet, and I'm going to drag that over. I'm going to set my grain to overlay mode, and I'm going to tell it to rasterize and trim so that it shrinks down to be the same size as my image. The reason that I used it as a much larger size is because that makes the grain bigger, and I quite like the grain to be big in a black and white image. It feels somehow more authentic to me. That's looking almost finished. One last thing that I can do before I finalize, I'm just going to have a look at what this looks like on different backgrounds. So I'm going to go to user interface, and I'm going to drag the slider up to the top here and see this is what it looks like on a white background. You see that my image is not pure white, it's just a bit under, which is where I like it. I'm going to pull it down to a black background, and again the blacks are not pure black, which is where I like it. So it's looking good. I like it. So we'll go back to having the mid-grey, which I find the most comfortable for viewing the image. And perhaps one last thing, I'm going to add a layer. So let's come into layer, and we're going to add a new fill layer, and we're going to set that to black, and we're going to tell that to rasterize and trim. So we've now got a plain black layer. I'm going to get a selection tool. Let's get the rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to have it feather at something like 2 pixels. That's good. And I'm going to go in here and just pull that across something like that, and then hit delete, and voila, we have a frame. And then you go. We've got a finished image. Looking pretty good. Thanks for joining.